clearly. That way everyone has a chance to.
And remember, try to speak up a little bit.
Okay. Are we good? Okay.
Good.
All right, well, first of all, thanks for having me come and speak. And also, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really gatherings like this all around the country that are so important to our efforts to govern ourselves as a free people. And it's really what makes us a free country. And as we're going to explore a little bit tonight, it's really the lack of influence of small gatherings like this when you sort of look at it in the nation as a whole that's at the heart of our political dysfunction. And we're going to talk a little bit about what can be done about that, what can be done to restore the influence of small citizen groups, and especially through the way that the political parties work. So with that in mind, how many folks here think that the country is headed in a generally good direction? Okay, I hear some laughs. How many people think the country's headed in a generally bad direction? Okay, is anyone out there not sure? Okay, I don't see anyone that's not sure. So, I was raised to believe that we live in the greatest republic in the history of the world, and I believe that our Constitution is still the best system in the world today. And that's why I was proud when I joined the U.S. Navy and took the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution. Later, around the time when I got out of the Navy, I found myself having more and more conversations with people who seemed to be giving up on our system of self-government. By the way, has anyone here had a conversation like that? Someone that says that, you know, we need to change the Constitution because it's not working, it's outmoded. People who say that, you know, our political system just doesn't work. Has anyone had those type of conversations with people? Just curious.
Yeah. So
that was really what kind of got me into this subject and then doing research. And I guess in my naivete, I thought that someone needed to do something about that sentiment and try and show people what a great system we have and the principles that it's founded on and all the reasons why we need to work to preserve it. And my wife would tell you that I couldn't sleep at night and that I became obsessed with finding these stories to really illustrate how our institutions developed and why we should cherish them instead of taking them for granted, or even worse, working to undermine them, the way that some groups out there would like to do. But along the way, I also stumbled on the reality of how our system got off track. And you know, I always tell people that I really wish that someone else would have written the book that I wrote, because it took me 7 years. And my wife really wishes that someone else would have written the book. But whatever half-formed thoughts prompted me to undertake the project, those thoughts and those reasons are only more valid today, 8 years later. Because we've gotten away from the principles that made our country great, and that's leading to problems that are becoming increasingly evident to more and more people. And the reason why I'm here, if I can really boil it down, is because of what it would mean for our country if some of these ideas that I'm going to share with you tonight became more widely understood and more widely known. So let's talk about how this situation in our country came about. How many people have heard of a guy named Russell Kirk? He was an author, a writer in the conservative movement in the post-war era. He wrote a book called The Conservative Mind in the early 1950s. And the book became quite influential on people like Ronald Reagan and other leading figures in the conservative movement. And in that book, he talks quite a bit about a historical English member of parliament named Edmund Burke. And he summarizes Burke's views on representative government and how, you know, Burke had this theory about why the English system was stable at the same time that the French system was basically falling apart in the French Revolution. And he went on to form this theory of why American political institutions were so stable as well. And there's one passage in particular that caught my eye where Kirk summarizes Burke's views this way. In the government of the nation, the people participated through their representatives. representatives, not delegates, elected from the ancient corporate bodies of the nation, rather than from an amorphous mass of subjects. So let's take that statement, which is kind of abstract, and break it into a couple of pieces, and talk about why this is so important. The first principle is representatives and not delegates. So what did he mean by that? If you go back to that period of history, and we're talking about the late 1700s, around the time when our Constitution was written, there were competing theories about the relationship between the people and their representatives in government. And one theory held that the representatives should have the discretion to go into a legislature, a deliberative assembly, and work things out amongst themselves and sort of calmly, coolly deliberate to form laws and make policy. And then there was another theory that held that these representatives were more like delegates, and they were bound by instructions from the people who elected them, and the people could say, you know, you will do this, you will not do this, and it was essentially a majority vote that would purport to determine what the representatives could and could not do. So when the founding fathers were writing our Constitution, they wanted us to have representatives and not delegates, and you'll see where I'm going with this in just a second. But they feared that the delegates, who would be bound by the will of the majority, would essentially make our Republican form of government into a democracy. And it would allow momentary passions and popular emotions to govern instead of this cool and calm deliberative assembly, which is what they envisioned for Congress and the state legislatures to be. They envisioned representatives who would serve as intermediaries and would arrive at decisions through thoughtful deliberation. And through that deliberation, their decisions would be based on tried and true principles, not momentary quick fixes to make people feel good. And so the result would be better and more stable laws. Or if you want to put it in even simpler terms, the result would be rule of law. Because you wouldn't have these fluctuating policies and these unstable and uninformed policies getting enacted like what we see today. And this is a big reason why many conservatives instinctively prefer representative government to direct democracy. Because the reality is progressive policies are always going to be the norm in a political environment that's dominated by emotional appeals. We've seen that a lot in the last few years, the use of emergencies to pass vast new areas of legislation. There's even that famous quote by Rahm Emanuel, to never let a crisis go to waste. I'm sure you all have heard that. Conservative policies win when the policies are enacted again with this temperament of calmness and deliberation, because it's the only way that true principles, timeless principles, can prevail. So if that's why conservatives prefer representatives and not delegates, then why the second principle? Election from representative subdivisions and not from the formless mass of the people. To answer the question, imagine what would happen if we took all votes cast for the presidency and put them into a single national pool. The way, incidentally, that some people propose that we elect the president by abolishing the Electoral College. So what would be the effect of that? First, it would greatly increase the cost of reaching likely voters. So with that, you'd have more money involved in the process, even more money than you have today. It would eliminate any trace of local and state influence on the ultimate outcome. And it would make people feel like their votes matter even less than they do today. Finally, and perhaps most importantly of all for the purposes of our discussion here tonight, if you eliminate those subdivisions, which are states in this case, it would centralize power in the federal executive because you'd be eliminating all of those intermediaries from the process. And this is why conservatives instinctively prefer election via subdivisions to elections en masse in a giant pool. Because again, we know that progressive policies are the norm when policies are dictated from on high. And the only way that you can really do that is in a system where there are no intermediaries. Conservative policies, on the other hand, win when government is in the hands of ordinary people. And the way to achieve that, the Founding Fathers even said this. You know, they had a lot of discussion in the Federalist Papers and at the Federal Convention about the need to divide a republic into subdivisions. They called it, they referred to it as an extended republic, because the theory at that time was that you couldn't have a republic over an extensive territory because it would break down into a despotism. And there were all these competing theories, but that was definitely one of the reasons why they felt the need to maintain the states and make the states an integral part of the federal Constitution. So now that we have this distinction between representative government and direct democracy, let's just recap what the effects of each of these are. So democracy is a centralizing force. Representative government, at least as the framers understood it, was decentralizing, just based on that structure. Democracy is impulsive, turbulent, and even violent. Representative government is calm and deliberative. And you end up with better policies, you end up with rule of law, really, is the end result. So is it any wonder that the framers of our Constitution preferred representative government? Here's what Madison famously said in Federalist Number 10, and I'm sure that many of you have read this. A pure democracy can admit no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A common passion or interest will be felt by a majority of the whole, and there is nothing to check the will of the majority. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security and the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. And the book that I wrote, The United States of Dysfunction, includes a few other choice observations by Madison that illustrate this theory of intermediary powers and reveal this secret that's been lost in our country of how to maintain that balance of power between the branches of government. We'll get to more of that in just a second. But even without getting too deep into that theory, let's take this idea of what the framers were trying to achieve one step further. Because the framers' view of democracy is often misrepresented. You know, we hear things like, they didn't want people to vote, or they wanted a small elite to control the country. Has anyone heard those types of characterizations? But let's see what they really said. At the Federal Convention, Elbridge Gerry said, in a democracy, the people would be the dupes of pretended patriots and demagogues. Doesn't that sound like how Obama got elected? Edmund Randolph spoke of the turbulence and follies of democracy. Doesn't that sound like how we got Obamacare and Dodd-Frank? Or how about the emotionalized efforts to enact gun control after Sandy Hook? George Mason spoke of the oppressions and injustice of democracy. Doesn't that sound like IRS targeting of minority groups or unchecked NSA spying on American citizens? And Alexander Hamilton had this to say, if we incline too much to democracy, we shall shoot into a monarchy. Doesn't that sound like where we are today? They predicted it all. It's quite remarkable. So let's talk about how this developed and what we can do about it. Because, you know, if you look at the Constitution, very little of it has changed. And we're going to talk about a few of the changes that were made that contributed to this result. But I'm also going to talk about some things that were never part of the Constitution, and yet they're part of how our political process works. And these things were changed around the same time that other changes in our system were made about 100 years ago. And a lot of these consequences that we're dealing with today, I would submit to you all, are effects of those changes. So let's get into that a little bit. So again, what were those two principles that Burke and Kirk thought were so important? Representatives and not delegates, and election from subdivisions. And the next question is, how were those principles incorporated into the original Constitution? The most obvious example is with the indirect election of senators. And I understand that you guys have been learning a bit about that and about how that contributed to federalism, at least for the first 100 years of our country. Another example is with the House of Representatives. There were discussions at the Federal Convention that the representatives in Congress should be subject to instructions from their constituents, and they kind of threw that out because of the complications that would arise and how it would undermine the representative system. And then you have the Electoral College. And I would say not because the electors ever served as representatives in choosing the president, but it's more the way that the Electoral College gives states a role in that presidential election process and how it divides up the vote into those subdivisions. There was also another way that representative principles were built into our system, and it wasn't part of the original Constitution, but it developed as political parties developed alongside some of the early elections, even with the election of Washington and Adams and Jefferson in the election of 1800. And the book that I wrote, The United States of Dysfunction, talks quite a bit about the history of the 12th Amendment and how it changed the Electoral College and how those changes are really key to understanding American political history. But even without getting into a lot of details about the 12th Amendment, you can see the importance of political parties and party conventions in the way that U.S. senators were chosen prior to the 17th Amendment. Because we all know that they were chosen by indirect election. The senators were appointed by the state legislatures. But there's another part of that process that's often overlooked, and that is the party nomination that led up to the legislative appointment. So if you go back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, for example, what was that all about? Lincoln was a Republican, Douglas was a Democrat, and if they're going to be chosen by the legislature, why were they going around Illinois debating each other in 1858? And the answer is that each of them was actually a party nominee. They were each nominees that had been nominated by the state convention, and then they were going around to these local legislative districts trying to influence the outcome of those races so that they would have a majority in the legislature and they would get to go to the U.S. Senate. And it's also a very little known fact that prior to the ratification of the 17th Amendment, 3/4 of the states were actually nominating their senators by direct primary. And if you think about the effect that that has, it's the same effect as direct election, really. Because now that you have a nominee, no matter how they're chosen, the legislature is going to follow that result. So what was the effect of that direct primary nomination? It goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier with what would happen if you abolish the Electoral College. You're going to increase the amount of money that it takes to reach the relevant electorate universe. You're going to make people feel like their vote doesn't matter as much. And by the way, how many folks here have been to a state convention before? Let's say a Republican state convention. So you all know how that process starts off, and I think it's very important to just describe that process real quick for anyone who hasn't been through it. You start off at the precinct level in a precinct convention. Maybe you have 3 or 4 people show up, and then I assume out here, do you go to a county convention or a Senate district convention?
County.
County convention, depends how big the county is. I live in Harris County, so we go to Senate district conventions. So out here you go to a county convention, and then that trickles up to choosing delegates that are going to go to the state convention. And then at the state convention in presidential years, they select delegates who are going to go represent the state party at the national convention. And the really important part about that process is that it's a representative process the whole way up. So you're persuading, a couple dozen, if you were to canvass your local precinct to become a delegate from the precinct convention to the county convention, you're talking maybe a couple hundred people at most that you'd have to influence to become a delegate. And so I would submit that in that very small scale process, that's what we've gotten away from, and that's how this nominating process that we use has gotten so out of control in this country. And it's even more apparent if you want to talk about what a circus the presidential nominating process has become. And it's the same forces that are at work. It's the same centralizing forces. It's the same moneyed influence. It's the same loss of influence by ordinary citizens that they still have under the convention system. The only problem is that convention system is no longer used to actually nominate candidates. That's what we've gotten away from. And so if you look at the effects of this, it's the reason why progressive policies are so dominant today. Going back to how I was talking about it just a minute ago, you know, this direct primary system has tilted everything so much in favor of progressive policies because of the centralized influence and because of the emotional appeals that hold sway under the system that we have. And I would submit that in the long run, the best and most effective way to combat that progressivism is going to be to stop playing by their rules, because they're the ones that passed all these direct primary laws around the turn of the century during the progressive era. And we need to tilt the field back in our favor by finding other ways through the convention process to select our nominees. So when we start talking about changing rules, we hear a lot about term limits, nullification, you know, these movements that are designed to really have an impact on the bottom line of how we're governed. And so nullification, many of you are familiar with it, is the idea that state legislatures or state officials can invalidate unconstitutional federal acts. And that's fine in theory, except in most cases, you don't have the votes, even at the state level, to carry out any kind of action like that. What about term limits? Well, we have term limits for the presidency, but if anyone has looked at the recent news, you know, we're already talking about nominating Hillary Clinton on the Democratic ticket and Jeb Bush on the Republican ticket. I mean, does that sound like term limits to you? Or at the state level, in states that have term limits, it's a very common practice for one member of the family to become term limited. And we don't have this happening in Texas, although you can see various shades of it even in Texas. Actually, I'll give an example of that in a minute. But what they do is they just look around the kitchen table and they find a wife or a husband or a son or a daughter or nephew, niece, whatever, someone with the same last name that has access to all the same fundraising contacts. And by the way, I mentioned the Texas example. Does anyone remember Ma and Pa Ferguson from, I think it was in the 1920s, that time frame. So Pa Ferguson was impeached as governor and banned for office from life. And what did he go and do? He had his wife running his place, and he basically became the governor through her name. It's a funny story, but it also shows that these term limits are only as effective as the nominating process that enforces them. And the book that I wrote talks about 3 major factors that entrench incumbents today, and how you can see these factors at work in just about every primary race that we have in this country. And you can almost use these factors to predict what the outcome of any given race is going to be. It's quite remarkable, you know. Back in 2012, there was a lot of talk about how we were going to have a brokered convention, and the delegates at the national convention were going to choose the nominee. And there's a lot of reasons why that was never going to happen, but the point that I want to make is just that a lot of times there's this discussion of certain possibilities that our system is going to produce that are really never going to happen. And I just think it's important that if we're going to really make a difference and get this country back on the right track, it's important for more people to understand the underlying principles and some of these underlying forces that are at work that really got us into the situation that we're in today. So as far as the actual proposal that I would offer in the book, this is really what the book kind of boils down to in terms of a concrete idea of let's do this. It's not to say that I'm married to this idea, but I do think it's at least worth talking about, and it's worth seeing what can be done. The idea would be to take candidates' names off the primary ballot, at least for the presidential races, and have primary voters choose delegates instead of candidates. So delegates would go on to represent voters in the selection of the candidate, and that's a method similar to how our Constitution originally worked in several of those areas that we were talking about a moment ago. This change would not require a constitutional amendment. State legislatures and state parties already have the power to make the change. And it doesn't even have to be done throughout the entire country, because the system has become so skewed in one direction, with every state using direct primaries to send delegates to the National Convention, that it would really only require the change to be made in a couple of small states or a big state like Texas to shake things up at the national level. And at the very least, you'd get an interesting convention out of that. Even just working toward this change could dramatically improve the political condition in this country, because it's going to require people to, at the grassroots level, to step up and get involved in the political parties. And on that note, this is an email that I got from someone who read my book in the last month or so, and I was very encouraged by this email, so I want to share it with you. And the subject line was, signed up for Denver County Precinct Chair position. And the body of the email said, just wanted to let you know I read most of your book over the holidays and finished it today. As you encouraged, I contacted my district captains about becoming more involved in the Denver County GOP. Would love to know more about your research, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really what it comes down to. You know, let's rediscover the power that we have as a free people through these existing institutions that are being underutilized, I think is a good way of putting it. Neglected would be another way of putting it. And let's start taking back this country, the last best hope for freedom on earth. Thank you.